Thank you, John. All right, we're going to get our afternoon session started with Professor Owen Hague, and he's the professor of geography and director of the School of Public Service at DePaul University in Chicago. He's also served on the Board of Governors of the Illinois St. Andrews Society since 2013. He's also moved to DePaul University in 2002 and published on Scottish American cultural issues and the Scottish diaspora in academic journals such as Scottish Affairs. And let's welcome Dr. Euan Hague. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi. Can everyone hear me okay?
Can you hear us all right?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
Okay, great. I think most people have retaken their seats. Well, I'd like to thank again John for inviting me. I know that the director of the Illinois St. Andrews Society, Gus Noble, is there with you. So hello to Gus. Thanks also for Peter behind the scenes, who enables you to hear me while I'm speaking on the microphone from my computer. So that's very, very much appreciated. I believe you. I'm going to talk a little bit about Scotland and North America in the 18th century. I believe I sent a series of notes. I don't know if they're in your packets, but I sent a series of notes to John that you can follow along with. I don't know if they actually made it into your packets or not. I think one of the things, just to give you a bit of introduction about myself first, I'm originally from Edinburgh in Scotland. I moved to the United States to study at Syracuse University in New York in 1994, and subsequently accepted a job here in Chicago at DePaul University in 2002. And now, though my family is still in Scotland, I am over here in the United States and have been for going on 25 years now. So I still kind of straddle those two worlds. I travel regularly back to see my family in Edinburgh. We're going back for Christmas with our children. So it's an interesting position to be in as a more recent emigrant, and I'm going to be talking more about the people who were here a few hundred years ago. I think one of the things to emphasize is that though in the 18th century, Scotland and North America seemed to be very, very separate and very distinctive, they were actually quite well connected in terms of trade, in terms of personal relationships, political relationships, and military relationships. I think we often assume that once immigrants came from Scotland to North America, they became completely isolated and cut off from their home country, and that really wasn't the case. There was obviously ships going back and forth on a regular basis, carrying news, carrying goods, and carrying people. So that's always something to remember in this context. A few key events of I think you've got to really, to understand Scottish immigration to North America in the 18th century, you actually have to go back to the end of the 17th century and what was called the Darien expedition. Between 1698 and 1700, Scotland tried to establish a colony in the area that is now Panama, and that was completely unsuccessful. They met resistance from the Spanish, who had troops in that area. Thousands of Scots who went, about 2,000 Scots went over there, were killed by tropical diseases. And what happened was particularly the elite, the wealthy Scots who wanted a colony, who wanted to be part of this colonial imperial game that was happening in Europe at the time, they basically lost thousands, and I don't know how much it would be, but the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money. And so that really creates a pressure around the turn of the 18th century for those wealthy elite Scots to join with their English counterparts and really push for the Treaty of Union. One of the key elements of one of the key factors creating the Treaty of Union was to give Scottish companies, and particularly the wealthy in Scotland, access to England's very lucrative North American colonies. So the reasons that we begin to see Scots arriving in North America is really as a result of the 1707 Treaty of Union, which gives Scotland access to England's, what at the time were England's North American colonies, and then of course they become the British North American colonies. The other big contextual thing happening at the beginning of the 18th century is, of course, in the first half of the 18th century, the Jacobite rebellions. And I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with those. But the Jacobite rebellions in 1715 and 1745, again, really leads to the establishment of the British state and the UK state. And it really kind of crushes any last vestiges of resistance to that state. And it creates this new vision, the success, the victory of the British troops at the 1746 Battle of Culloden led to the British state really becoming, the global player of the 18th and 19th century. It's actually interesting that, of course, the Jacobites, if you're not familiar, the Jacobites were largely driven by the effort to restore a Catholic monarchy. And so they were actually quite unpopular in North America. They were seen, particularly amongst the English colonies. Jacobites were much more closely allied with France. And of course, we have that sort of competition between the English settlements and the French settlements in North America and into both what became the United States and Canada. And so actually one of the things that happened in the English colonies in North America is that most of the people who had come and settled from Scotland in North America in the 1730s and 1740s were actually Protestant, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and so were actually quite opposed to the Jacobites. After the Jacobites were defeated in 1746 at Culloden, the British government passes a couple pieces of legislation. 1746 Act of Prescription, which was repealed in 1782, but for that generation between 1746 and 1782, it disarms the Highland population and it disarms the people who rebelled against the British government. And it also mandated transportation as indentured servitude, as indentured servants for a period of 7 years for people who were involved in the rebellion. The other very famous one, which I'm sure you're familiar with, was the 1746 Dress Act, which made it illegal for men and boys in Scotland to wear the kilt or any part of that traditional Highland dress. And one of the major reasons for that is because it was seen as the military uniform of the enemy. The Jacobites had worn Highland dress, and therefore Highland dress was associated as a military uniform of the enemy. But what the British government did at that stage was very clever. They created Scottish regiments that could wear plaid and could wear tartan and could wear kilts and could wear Highland dress. And one route into maintaining that part of your Scottish identity became to join the British military in a Highland or a Scottish regiment. And then what we see is those regiments get moved internationally, and some of them come to what is now North America to fight in the French and Indian Wars a decade later. There's a number of other push factors that are pushing people out of Scotland to North America. After the Jacobite Rebellion, you have a complete change in the farming system in Scotland. The clan chiefs are no longer seen as people who receive patronage. They're seen much more as landowners and landlords, and they're treated as big landowners, and they're people that rather than pay homage to the clan chief, or rather than pay tribute to the clan chief or military service to the clan chief, you're paying cash, you're paying rent. And a lot of people in Scotland began to sort of feel, well, this wasn't really what they were interested in. And you have that as you begin to pay rent, you're getting pushed onto the worse and worse land, because the former clan chief, who is now the lord of that area, wants to become rich through farming. And so you have this creation of enclosed fields, the kind of shared fields of the clan system, what was called the runrig system, is dissolved. And the landlords, the clan chiefs, create fields. They put sheep on them. The people who are left crofting are on worse and worse land. And so the opportunity to move to North America, to move to the now British colonies in North America, becomes very attractive. Sheep move in Scotland, and people move out. Where do people move to? Well, if you've got the money, you can get a ticket on a boat to America. If you've not got the money, you're moving to the urban slums of someone like Glasgow. And so you also have the beginning of this beginning Industrial Revolution in the mid-18th century, again, pulling people off the land in Scotland into Scotland cities. Other people are moving internationally. One of the major ways, as I mentioned, to move internationally was, for Scots at this time, was military service. And Scottish soldiers came as part of the British Army to fight in the French and Indian Wars in the 1750s and 1760s. And Scottish regiments were involved in the sieges of Quebec City and battles and the successful capture of Montreal in 1759 and in Quebec, 1760 in Montreal. And many of those Scots who had fought in the British military against the French in favor of the United Kingdom, then were given land in Canada and land in the areas of Quebec after the British had successfully taken that land, taken those cities and defeated the French. And so you have this beginning of settlement throughout North America, throughout not only the English colonies in what we now know as the United States, but also in the areas of what we now know as central eastern Canada that had been taken from the French. I think another key connection, and again, this sort of leads right into the American Revolution, but another key connection was the intellectual connection. I mean, I'm at a university, I understand that, but one of the key connections was academic. You had obviously John Witherspoon sets up Princeton University. You have one of the rules in one of the at the time in the mid 18th century, Edinburgh University in Scotland was one of the still is, but it was one of the premier places to study medicine. And so what you had was a number of young men, children of the American elite, go to university in Edinburgh, learn medicine, and come back to North America to establish not only universities and medical schools and hospitals and so forth. So you definitely had this intellectual trade between Scotland and North America. One of the key elements again was the importance of the church, but you have somebody like Benjamin Franklin visiting Scotland in 1759 and 1771 and trying to make sure that American institutions and American universities hired people from Scotland because they were seen as being the kind of intellectual leaders, some of the best educated in the world. So not only do you have the poor farmers of Scotland coming to North America either as soldiers or as settlers to try and own land and become emigrants, you also have this more elite upper class group who are becoming educated and eventually will become some of the obviously intellectual leaders of the United States. There's a quote from an author called Andrew Hook who says, 18th century Scotland attracts Americans as it is the center of progress and enlightenment. So there was this real idea that if you wanted a modern cutting edge education, Scotland was the place to go. So where did Scots go in 18th century America? I've already mentioned in 18th century North America. I've already mentioned some of the settlements in Canada as a result of military excursions. There was actually quite a big settlement of Scots in Georgia under Governor Oglethorpe, who establishes Georgia in 1732, and rules there until 1743. He actively recruited people from Scotland to come and populate places like Savannah. He had a population of Gaelic-speaking Highlanders in Darien, Georgia. And quite interestingly, they were strongly anti-slavery at the time. Slavery was only added to Georgia after Oglethorpe left, and Oglethorpe leaves in 1743 and actually fights against the Jacobites back in northern England in 1745. I think so. What we see is Scots moving to America in the that's Oglethorpe's in the 1730s, 1740s, but the big influx of Scots in North America in the 1760s, 1770s are going to all the 13 colonies across New England, Virginia, the Carolinas, into Georgia. There's a lot of people up in New York. One of the things about this Scottish population was that it was rarely concentrated. Quite often people were dispersed. They would get land. They would set up farms. And so that Scottish population was dispersed. And there's an academic called Charlotte Erickson who wrote a book. It's almost 50 years old now, but she made the argument that the Scots and the English in many ways were the invisible immigrants. They didn't, because most of them spoke English, they didn't cluster together in groups. There was no need to have a kind of ethnic community. And so they dispersed across the colonial world to just anywhere where they could get a foothold and begin to make their lives. The other thing, Andrew Hook there, again, who's probably the leading academic on this, he argues that the total number of Scottish emigrants to America in the 18th century has often been greatly exaggerated. It's estimated that between 1763 and 1775, that immediate pre-revolutionary period, around 25,000 Scots migrated to America. And that is a lower number than the Scots-Irish or the Ulster Scots, who had quite a different relationship to North America than people moving directly from Scotland. And of course, we have some of the earliest Scottish American organizations. There was a St. Andrew's Society founded in Philadelphia in 1747. And that was really by elite leaders in Philadelphia, the sort of 25 very wealthy, well-connected Scottish immigrants get together in 1747 to advance the cause of really sort of Scottish ideas around religion and politics and so forth. The most famous settlement, probably the kind of one area that did have a concentration of Scottish settlers in the 1770s, was the Cape Fear River area of North Carolina. Very famously, it was probably the most concentrated area of Gaelic-speaking Highlanders in North America. And the main reason for that is boats coming across from the Highlands would come to Brunswick, North Carolina, or Wilmington, North Carolina, on the Cape Fear River. That was literally the port people came into, and then those settlers coming in would get boats and go upriver. And they go upriver, and one of the critical things here is that as a colony, North Carolina was selling land cheaply to settlers. And these people who in Scotland who had been relatively poor farmers, who are now paying rent in the Highland to a landowner or a landlord, rather than having any kind of clan chief, rather than paying rent, they could come to North Carolina and they could own land. And that was obviously a major attraction. And you actually had colonial officials handing out pamphlets in Scotland, recruiting people. You had people traveling back and forth saying, like, hey, come to North Carolina, you can get land. And so it became a point of entry, and people would go upriver, up the Cape Fear River, and set up small farms. And that area at the time was heavily wooded. And so to make a farm, you had to cut down trees, which was also good because it meant you had fuel and you had timber to build a house. And so you had the resources in place to establish a farm, to graze your cattle, and then because you were on this network of rivers, you could sell your crops down the river. And so in the 1760s and 1770s, you actually had around the Cape Fear River area of North Carolina a relatively large concentration of Gaelic-speaking Highland Scots who, unlike their counterparts elsewhere, were actually also engaged in that plantation economy and began to participate in owning slaves. One of the critical things, though, is when the U.S. Revolution comes in 1776, most of those Cape Fear Highlanders form regiments that were loyal to the British government. And I think one of the things here is that most of the people who had settled in the colonies saw the role of the United Kingdom and the British Crown as having given them the opportunity to settle and make a living in these colonies. And a lot of them were loyal to the Crown. There was some on both sides, but there's actually there's a well-known battle of Moores Creek Bridge in 1776, where Loyalist Highlanders formed a regiment, but they were defeated by American patriots or revolutionaries. And so the attitude in Scotland towards the North American Revolution, the United States Revolution, was really that the American patriots were traitors. They were fighting against the government of the day. They were fighting against the British Crown. They were fighting against the British political structure in North America, and the most popular opinion in Scotland at the time was opposed to these rebels and as treasonous. There's a quote here from a Scottish historian, Michael Fry, who says that a majority of 18th century Scots saw the American revolutionaries of the 1770s as verminous traitors to king and empire. So there was little contemporary support for the American Revolution in Scotland in the 1770s. In fact, John Witherspoon, famously the Scot who signed the Declaration of Independence, was roundly condemned in Scotland for fomenting revolution and for being a revolutionary who was opposed to the Crown and opposed to the British state. And this kind of went both ways. Very famously, well, maybe not very famously, maybe not very well known, but Thomas Jefferson, in an early version of the Declaration of Independence, one of the first drafts, explicitly condemned King George for, and this was cut out of the Declaration of Independence on a second or third edit, but on the first edit it said King George was condemned for transporting large armies of Scotch and other mercenaries to complete the work of death, destruction, and tyranny already begun with unaccustomed cruelty and perfidy unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. So amongst the American revolutionaries, they saw the Scottish regiments as part of the British military. They saw these groups of Gaelic-speaking militias in places like North Carolina as serving the king and therefore being opposed to the American patriots. So again, a really interesting division. After the most Scots in North America, most Scottish settlers in North America were actually seen by the revolutionary Americans as loyalists, as conservative, as not these sort of radical American patriots. Of course, there was someone who contradicted that, but in general, that was how the battle lines were drawn. And so after the 1776 revolution, many Scots who'd settled in the what had been the English colonies that became the United States fled and went to Canada, where of course the British government and the British Crown still ruled. So in the 1790 U.S. Census, one of the things that we see is there's about 160,000 people identify as Scottish in the early United States. In 1790, it's about 4% of the population, compared to about double that who identified as Scotch-Irish. And that's, again, a very sort of different understanding. So as I was putting this together, we got about 5 minutes before I'm happy to try and answer any of your questions. I think arguably the most important Scottish immigrant group to North America certainly in the second half of the 18th century is actually ideas. And you had the Enlightenment philosophers like David Hume, Adam Smith, Francis Hutcheson is a little older, he came slightly earlier, Adam Ferguson, all these sort of giants of Scottish education, Scottish Enlightenment thought, had these ideas of like a civil society, of creating of a society that there shouldn't be a king with laws derived from God. It should be laws derived from the people. And there's actually a number of arguments that sort of trace the Scottish Enlightenment philosophy and political thought from these authors like Adam Smith and David Hume through to Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. So these elite circles of the American patriots, like Franklin and Jefferson and Witherspoon, were very much tied up with these ideas of what a political governance should be like. And so although you had Scottish people coming to the United States, coming to the area that becomes the United States in the 18th century and establishing farms and advancing their religious beliefs. And here in the military, they were here primarily as members of the British military, opposed to either the French or the American patriots and revolutionaries. But the ideas that drive the American Revolution largely come from Scotland. So I like to think that sometimes we focus a lot on the settlement patterns and we don't sort of think about how ideas move around as well. And so I think that's something to remember, that ideas became very Scottish derived ideas became very influential, these Enlightenment ideas, in establishing the United States of America. And I've got a few, I don't know if you got, John has my notes and he's happy to share them. Please share them if anyone asks. But I've got a couple of examples. I've got a show and tell here because I got a camera. If you're interested, there's this book by James Hunter called A Dance Called America, the Scottish Highlands and I can't see the front of it. The Scottish Highlands in the United States and Canada by James Hunter. There's a book by Andrew Hook called Scotland in America, 1750 through 1833. And Andrew Hook's another one by Andrew Hook. This is called From Goose Creek to Gander Clew, Studies in Scottish American Literary and Cultural History. Each one of these, if you're interested in that period of the 18th century and Scottish settlement and Scottish connections to North America in the 18th century, these three books will give you a good guide. And there's one I don't have with me right now, but it's by Gary Wills and it's called Inventing America. And it's all about the philosophers the Scottish philosophers who influenced Jefferson, Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and the others. So I'm happy to share these titles directly with John, and he can pass them around. And I think we're on question time now. So thank you very much. Hope that you're able to hear me clearly, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Professor Hague, thank you so much from all of us here in Detroit. Well, in Troy, I should say. We hope you'll be with us next time in person. This was fascinating. So has anybody got any questions? Can we take this conversation a bit further? Great. So this is all done.
Thanks. Professor, early on in your talk, you mentioned something about Episcopalians being viewed as Protestants and being opposed, therefore, to the Catholics in the Jacobite sort of dichotomy. And my understanding is that most of the Jacobites in the Highlands, at least, were Episcopalians. And if you were an Episcopalian, you were automatically considered to be a Jacobite. And so Toryism included the concept of Episcopalians not only in Scotland but also in the colonies. And so in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for instance, the Episcopal Church on Harvard Square was ransacked, and every Episcopalian in Massachusetts had to get the hell out of Dodge and go to Canada. Because they were seen the same way. They were seen as loyalists, and with the result that, you know, when General Washington arrived during the campaign and his wife wanted to attend an Episcopal church on Christmas Day, they had to find an Episcopal priest and reopen the church Anyway, that was my understanding, that Episcopalians were seen very much, most of the Jacobites in the Highlands were actually not Roman Catholic. I mean, yes, of course, most of Clan Ronald was, most of Flora MacDonald and her family would have been, but most otherwise would have been Episcopalians. Right.
Certainly, I think you're evidently more knowledgeable about that detail than I am. So that sounds correct. Certainly, the Scots were definitely considered Tories at the time of the Revolution, and I hadn't heard that story about the ransacking of the church in Boston, but that makes perfect sense. The religious complexity of those days is something I must admit that I'm not quite as up to speed on. So I appreciate your comment.
And is there further questions from anybody? Oh, yes. Gus Noble from Chicago, Scots.
Oh, I don't take his questions.
Hey, Euan, how are you?
Good. How are you, Gus?
It's not really a question, but I'm going to sing Euan's praises for a moment. As well as the fascinating subject on which he's spoken today, Euan has done some great research into Scottish romance novels. And Euan, I wondered if you would say a few words about that particular part of your research.
I don't have any with me. They're all in my office and I'm at home. Yes, I have. I told John this on the phone, but we agreed to stick to the 18th century. But so one of the things that I came to the United States in 1994, and one of the things that I was surprised to learn about was Outlander, and the entire subgenre of Harlequin-style romance novels that Outlander had engendered in North America. So one of the things I've written a couple of articles interviewing people, interviewing primarily American women writers who create these historical romance novels, which often involve a modern American woman traveling back in time to be ravished passionately by a kilted Highland warrior. And so these stories is actually one of the most popular subgenres of romance novels, and a number of authors who Margaret Mallory I've interviewed, and I can't think of Susan King, a few others. There's a woman called Sue Ellen Wellfonder who wrote one called Devil in a Kilt. And so there's this remarkable subgenre. So what was really interesting to me was these romance novels are not popular in Scotland, although it's a multi-million-dollar industry, and it's one of the main ways that people in the United States understand what historical Scotland was like. And I think one of the most interesting things when I interviewed these authors is how dedicated to getting those details correct there are. And I remember having a long conversation with a woman called Blythe Gifford, who has written a series of books called the Border Trilogy, about a border clan that was torn between Scotland and England, and romance ensues. But yeah, really fascinating. And she was asking me to go through, because I'm an academic, I can get onto these academic archives. And she's asking me, can you find me the 1954 PhD thesis by this person, which is about King James IV? And I'm like, I can look and try and find it, because that's the most valuable document I'll need for rewriting this scene about his, something that happened to him. So it's been a really interesting time, and I thank Gus for bringing it up. The start touch point for all this is Outlander, which of course is now a TV series. But if you're interested in that genre, there are hundreds, and there are so many of these Scottish-based romance novels, and they almost always involve like 5 brothers having romance with 5 sisters, or as I say, this weird subgenre of an American woman from today going back in time, just like Outlander, to enjoy the romantic attentions of a Scottish warrior. So it's certainly been a very fun, and it's kind of strange, coming from Scotland, 20th century Scotland, coming to the United States in the 1990s, and actually learning that romance novels was a way that was one of the ways that a lot of people learn Scottish history in the United States.
We've just been doing a questionnaire here that we're going to discuss tomorrow, but one of the main questions is how do you connect, and it's about history. So maybe we need to subgenre that and ask if it's fictional or fact. And on to you, Professor Drury, a question.
Hi, Euan.
Hi.
I actually flew across here rather than doing this by Skype. So.
Oh, that was good of you.
I love what you said about the Scottish romance novels. When I was growing up, my grandfather, a Scottish miner, read nothing but Western novels. Zane Grey, Louis L'Amour, and because of that, we watched nothing but black and white Westerns on the television. So when I first came to Scotland, when I was to America, I was about 17. My first visit, I went, "Where are all the cowboys?" I had the same sort of slanted view of culture as perhaps people get from the Scottish novel. But that's not what I was going to say. I'm interested in how this idea has come about that the American Declaration of Independence is in any way connected with the 1320 Arbroath document, right? First of all, it was never a declaration. It was a begging letter to the Pope in Avignon, who was looking after John Balliol at the time. It was not about the rights of the common man. It was embedding and enshrining the rights of a particular set of aristocrats of the Bruce faction. And it was saying to the Pope, could you stop England being nasty to us, Nothing could be further away from the sentiments espoused in that your great founding document here in America. And it wasn't even called the Declaration of Arbroath until after 1812, when the Americans kind of discovered their Declaration of Independence. And how has this got embedded into the idea of Scottish American, that your founding document has crept out from behind an old letter in Scotland like a shy puppy, and in fact you should take ownership of it and be extremely proud that it was written unbidden from yourselves. Now look at the Dutch Bill of Rights and various French libertarian writings and so on, but there is absolutely nothing in anything Thomas Jefferson left in his writings that suggests he even knew of its existence. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I would agree with that assessment. I think there's no, if you actually read what was being written in Scotland in the 1770s about the Declaration of Independence, there's no mention there of Arbroath either. So it's certainly a recent invention. There's this thesis amongst historians, the invention of tradition, about how people today invent traditions that, or not today, but since the 19th century, have invented things that they now claim are ancient traditions, but actually they're relatively recent inventions. I think I would say that there was an attempt to establish there was tartan days being established in Canada in the late 1980s, and when that idea of having a day to celebrate Scottish American identity comes to the fore in the United States again around about the time I moved here in the mid 1990s, a rationale was sought, and I think one of the things that happened was just like having this idea of a Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's so to the forefront of the American of how people think here, and the mind, of course, of American politics. That, and I think also you tie that in with the ideas of genealogy and researching your roots. So there becomes this sort of movement. Well, what are the genealogical roots of America? Where does that come from politically? And I think again, there's this sort of idea that if the further we can go back, the better. And here's this 1320 document from Scotland. So I would agree that I would advocate that you're better to, if you, in my opinion, a much stronger precedent for the Declaration of Independence is really seen in Enlightenment political thought of the time, of the 1770s. And say Gary Wills's book, Inventing America, does a really good job of laying that out. People like Jefferson, Franklin, and others were moving in these intellectual circles, and were not thinking about medieval Scots protesting to the Pope. They were thinking about how do you create a modern civil democracy and what are the cutting edge political ideas of the 1770s, not what were they thinking back in the 1320s. But I do think it becomes an easy shorthand to say, oh, here's a group of people rebelling against the crown, trying to establish their own identity. And so that kind of pop culture narrative seems to fit both neatly, even though for a scholar and a historian such as yourself and others, that connection is tenuous to non-existent.
Just to point out something about Tartan Day. Tartan Day is held on April 6th in honor of the Declaration of Arbroath. But from what I have known, and I'm with the American Scottish Foundation, who are one of the parties involved in spearheading Tartan Day coming together with this congressional process, was that it was really about the Scots who had helped to make America. And Mark of the Scot was a book that was placed on the seats, I am told, of every senator to help it go through. So I think it a little, I just want to correct that it was not provised upon being about the Declaration of Arbroath. It's held on the date of, but it wasn't, that was not the driving force. But I'm going to hand over to John Belisai for him to give a rebuttal, because he's also involved in Tartan Day, but also is so involved with everything to do with Washington.
I really this here because this is not the point of your.
I can't hear you.
Except to say that there is another view, and I'll send you my paper, and maybe you'll take the time to read it. You can make a good circumstantial case for it. Dr. Dury knows this, but he never wants to acknowledge it. For some reason, there's only got to be one view on this. But there are two. So I'll send you the paper. Dury has it. He needs to read it.
Okay, I didn't quite catch the audio is not so good there. I appreciate the opportunity to read the paper. Gus can give you my email address. He's sitting right there. Just Gus, pass on my email to him, please.
And do we have any more questions after this spirited interaction? It's been wonderful to have you here, Professor. Any more? John, our illustrious chairman.